Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thanks for joining us again on kind of day two. We're being talking about kind of what we can learn from past crisis fundraising examples, some lessons learned along with some kind of specific examples. We're going to wait just 1 second here. There's a couple of people who are logging in from the waiting room. Then we'll get started. All right. Looks like we got most of the folks on. So we'll go ahead and get started. Again, for those of y'all that maybe weren't with us for parts of yesterday, my name is Matt Gayer. I'm the co-executive director at the Catalogue for Philanthropy. And we're looking at kind of past crisis fundraising for kind of lessons for now, right? I will say, and we'll talk about this a bit in a second, no one model of disaster fundraising is going to fit what we're facing perfectly right now. As is popular to say, these are unprecedented times. We'll talk a little bit, though, about there are still a lot of lessons to learn, just maybe not from just one specific model. So when we think about crisis fundraising at a really high level, right, just kind of what happens during a crisis, typically for fundraising for a nonprofit historically. During an economic crisis, when it's economic in nature, like the Great Recession in 2008, not surprisingly, giving goes down, right, when it's economic in nature. During economic growth, historically for the last 50 years, we actually have seen 4.5 to 5% growth annually in giving. So giving almost always goes up when times are good. And then during years where the economy is down, we actually see on average about 0.5% decline. So really what we're talking about there is we're not really seeing the fact that like giving drops dramatically. The biggest thing is that it doesn't continue to grow. So while the rest of our costs are going up, inflation's happening, everything else is happening, giving remains in kind of pure dollars pretty stagnant or a slight decline typically if the economy is down. What we see typically is that actually turns into a little bit of a decline for non-frontline organizations and a little bit of a growth for frontline organizations. And we'll talk about that a bit more in a second. For instance, during the Great Recession, essential services organizations like food banks, homeless shelters, organizations that were working on the front line, they actually saw giving increase by about 10%. And then organizations that weren't deemed kind of essential saw giving decrease by about 20%. So that's why you see typically when you look at research from the Great Recession, nonprofits lost about 8% in revenue at the time. It was about 18% for non-essential with kind of growth of about 10% for essential. So there is a little bit of a difference based on our social issue, obviously. One reason for this that we see is not just kind of because people have less money, but also because fear breeds kind of less generosity a bit. So when we look at this, we don't just look at how much was given, but we also look at the percent given of GDP, right? So we track this every year. This tells us at a really high level with a lot of problems related to the stat, how generous, right, America is being, right? Out of all the money we have, what percentage are we donating back? We see that percentage drop during any time of economic crisis. Not surprisingly, right, folks treat kind of giving a little bit like a luxury item when they're of kind of upper middle class or upper class. So that as kind of surplus funds go, as stocks go down, people then kind of hold their purse strings a little tighter, right? And then finally, the last thing we want to highlight in general when thinking about economic crisis fundraising is that it's long-term in nature. As a couple of folks brought up yesterday during the keynote, this year is going to be a challenge, but really we're most worried about next year and the year kind of even following. When we looked again at data from the Great Recession, giving decreased by about 7% in 2008, the first year of the crisis, but by slightly more at 8% in 2009. So not that it's going to get exponentially worse, but it probably won't get much better for 12 months is kind of the takeaway from that. And it took till about 2012 to actually get back above where they were before the crisis began. So about a 4-year cycle of a little bit of a drop, a slightly bigger drop, a little climb, back to normal. So what that means for us, we'll talk about a lot of kind of tips and responses to some of these things in a second. But it means we can't just focus on kind of getting money in the door quickly today with kind of emergency funds. There's definitely some of that we're going to have to do, but we really need to focus on still being relational, right? So we can't just hit our donors over the head and try to get money today. We have to make sure they're going to still be showing up for the next 12 to 18 months. At the same time, though, as I hinted at the beginning here, there is no model for what we're going through right now, right? So all the stuff we just shared was about economic crisis fundraising. There's also a ton of research out there about disaster fundraising, right? Like when a hurricane or tornado hits. The difference, though, is there's a lot of flaws with both of these as they relate to kind of our current situation in fundraising. So one reason is just because we're facing both, right? We're facing a non-economic disaster that's led to an economic crisis. So we have insight into both disaster and recession fundraising, but not necessarily doing both at the same time. One takeaway from this is that we're really going to have to engage donors on a one-off or small group basis because we're not going to be able to assume trends, right? So disaster fundraising would tell us individual donors are actually going to be more generous because they step up in times of kind of physical disaster response. So you would think that people would be stepping up, as we have seen examples of during COVID, to help healthcare and food banks, right? And economic recovery and all those kind of direct needs. At the same time, though, during an economic crisis, we see giving go down. So it's a little bit of a wash. So there's not going to be a broad trend here. This really is going to be, we're going to have to engage folks on small, direct levels to get a sense of if they're going to give. The second thing is the fact that disaster fundraising is not meant for a long-term disaster. Disasters, by their very nature, are a short-term urgent crisis that then has a long recovery period, right? This disaster is still kind of actively unfolding and will be for a minimum of 9 months, right? If you think about the rest of 2020, very likely 12 or 18 months. So with a long-term disaster, what does that look like? One takeaway for us is going to be the fact that we're going to have to ask more than once for urgent requests during the same disaster, right? So typically if a hurricane hits, we have one big ask, one big emergency fund for our response to a hurricane, right? We don't have to necessarily go back during the same urgent time twice. So what that means for us is that when we do go back a second time during COVID, so if we either already asked during COVID or if we're going to ask a couple times in the future over the next year, we need to have really specific impact and really specific context each time we ask. We're going to have to explain why now the second time we're asking is a little bit different than the first. We won't be able to just go with the fact that like COVID's happening, economic crisis is happening, we need your help. We're going to have to change it up a bit. And then finally, all of this is happening during obviously a time of social isolation and also social unrest. Two things that are not typically happening during a disaster or economic crisis to the level of those right now. So while folks are feeling isolated, they feel the community is divided, they feel the community is kind of leaving them out or leaving them behind. We need to make sure that any pitch we're making and any fundraising campaign we're doing is making it very clear how community is the central part of it. How both we're helping the community, but also how they can be part of a community of supporters. People need to feel like this isn't just isolated, I'm giving 50 bucks myself, but I'm part of a larger effort, because that's what folks are looking for right now, that sense of collective action. Someone was asking about kind of why we see fundraising decrease for kind of a year after the active crisis. A lot of times that's just because economic shocks take a long time to hit. So, if stocks go down now, that actually kind of decreases wealth in kind of the 12 months following. If stocks go down now, endowments for foundations don't actually get hit till the following year. And a lot of times there's kind of lingering things like unemployment that don't bounce back right away. So that's why a lot of times we see giving continue to decrease for kind of 12 months after an active crisis. So our first tip for responding to this is to be really consistent, right? So when we look at any example, especially for economic crisis fundraising, it's really important we're thinking about how are we staying present during this kind of time of uncertainty, right? So we talked about this a little bit in some of the other fundraising workshops we've done during the summit, but thinking about how to be regular in our communications and outreach to donors. So, when we look back at the organizations that did best and that lost the least during the 2008 recession, it was those that kept actively fundraising, kept their fundraising staff on. Typically, we should be sending at least a monthly email to supporters, right? We want to have a pretty frequent newsletter, kind of letting them know what's happening at the organization, keeping us top of mind for them. And we want to do that roughly the same time every month. We really want that to be kind of just a principal thing that every first Tuesday of the month, we're letting them know what's happening with the organization. We want to create some sense of habit and some sense of normalcy during a time that is anything but. We want to make sure that we're showing up and kind of being present. So as things unfold in the crisis, we're going to need to make sure we're being responsive to it. So that regular communication is great, but because this is a disaster that's kind of long-term unfolding, As things shift in our area and our community, we need to show that we're being responsive and adaptive to it. So in addition to those regular communications we're sending out, if major developments occur or when they occur, we need to have some type of plan for response. So that's going to range from things as when our school districts decide if they're going to open up or not, to if there's a second wave, all those types of things that, we need to respond about how it's impacting our clients. So once again, we want to localize. We're not responding just to have a response, but we're responding about how it impacts our plans, our work, and our clients. So people have a sense of what's going on with us and a sense that we're stepping up to help during a time of need. And then finally, we want this to be accessible, right? So we're going to use a lot of different channels. Folks are going to get a lot of information over the next few months. So using email, using social media, using even some of those group meetings we've talked about with donors, all going to be important channels to kind of get in front of people and keep this information top of mind. Asking for their advice and opinions and support during this time is going to be helpful, and non-financial support is going to be helpful for kind of keeping them engaged. And in general, we want to write these in a really kind of plain language, authentic voice. Folks' comprehension and kind of ability, literacy rate, actually in kind of reading level goes down during times of stress. We see this all the time in healthcare. So it's really important to make sure that we're writing kind of clearly, plainly, from a personal perspective, and typically try and keep it pretty short. Folks have a lot going on right now. So making sure that they can kind of engage with the content we have, but do so quickly is important. The second tip we have, Jamie talked a little bit about this during the keynote, but really focusing on retention. So what we see a lot of times during disasters, during previous kind of natural disasters, is that folks go to the organizations they already know of, right? This is one reason why people don't typically do research into kind of small local organizations that are doing disaster response to physical disasters, despite the fact that they should, but they often just donate to like the Red Cross, right? They donate right away to the humanitarian organizations they've heard of. That's not necessarily for anything those organizations are doing. It's because they've already heard of the Red Cross, so therefore they're going to give quickly to the Red Cross when they need to make a decision. The same is true for our donors. So when a crisis hits, they're going to first think about you, and we need to make sure that that thought is turning into action, that we're keeping those donors engaged. Additionally, it's going to be hard to necessarily get new folks, unless we're essential services. If we're working on the front line, we do have some opportunity to acquire new folks there, but even there, a lot of times people will go to the bigger nonprofits that they know of, not necessarily the local organizations they haven't heard of before. So a few things when thinking about how we retain donors right now. The first thing is we're going to think about making sure our pitch stays relatively the same. So just because there's a crisis doesn't mean we're going to throw out what we typically talk about for the organization. These folks that gave to us before COVID especially still care for the same reason, right? If they were giving to us before because they're really passionate allies of the LGBT community, they're still going to be really passionate allies of the LGBT community. They're just going to need to know more about the urgency and opportunity of giving and supporting right now. We want to remind the existing donors why they care so much about our work and really kind of double down on that traditional pitch. At the same time, we are going to want to update it and really add that urgency in and add a sense of impact right now. What I mean by that is really focusing our pitch around our engagement right now, around kind of what we're doing in the community right now, kind of virtually or in person. We don't want to talk about organizational challenges more than we have to. So, we can be honest about the fact that this is a tough time. We really need your support. A lot of folks are pulling back giving, but at the same time, we don't want to make this, can you donate because we're running low on cash? That's not going to motivate a donor. We really need to keep the focus where it matters, which is with our clients and with the impact we're having in the community. And talking about specifically how either those pre-existing needs of our clients are even more urgent now because of everything going on, or there's new issues our clients are facing because of everything going on. And then finally, for keeping those existing donors, small group meetings can be really effective. So obviously one-on-ones are going to be helpful here, but also trying to get as many donors as possible, and at least invited. They probably won't attend always, but at least invited to something, right? That feels exclusive to them. So doing these briefings with kind of 50 donors at a time, right? doing these kind of small group sessions, town halls, brainstorming sessions, whatever that looks like, finding a way to get some or the majority of your donors into some type of, even if it's a 100-person or less meeting, if you have a lot of donors, you need to think about kind of a bigger group. We want to make them kind of feel special, unique, and that we appreciate their past support. The third tip is really thinking about the stories we tell. So when we think about ways to kind of cut through the noise and engage folks, this is true typically with kind of a busy media cycle, but even more true right now, is that stories kind of cut through that noise, build those connections, right? And kind of provide the context we need for people to understand the urgency of what we're working on. So we want to make sure the stories we're telling, the ways we're telling those when we're soliciting or engaging donors and supporters, is that we're focusing on raw and personal stories. And what I mean by that isn't overly emotional or kind of, haphazardly thrown together, but it's just that it feels really authentic, right? That I'm highlighting the urgency for our staff. I'm highlighting the urgency for our clients. I'm talking about it from a first perspective. We're using kind of some of the space in the story to kind of paint the picture and the scene, right? Especially as a local organization, the more we can talk about where it happened, right? Talking about the community in which it happened. Folks are going to, think to themselves, oh, I drive by there, I work there, I live there. The more that happens, the better. We know 2/3 of all giving happens within, I think it's about 25 square miles of where someone lives, right? So it's hyper local in most cases. So we want to think about how are we tapping into that kind of local sense with some really authentic and personal stories. These stories are often going to be about or from our clients, right? So really talking about kind of what this disaster, what this crisis has meant for the people and communities we serve, right? So a lot of times, especially our donor community, might be very different in kind of composition than the folks we serve. So they're not always going to understand all the challenges that our clients are facing because of this crisis. So we want to kind of paint that picture and kind of give them an inside look at what's happening there. At the same time, we also want to highlight some staff stories, right? I know from working with our partners, there are some amazing stories of what nonprofit staff have gone through, the amount of work they've put in to kind of make this digital shift and make sure they're still showing up and answering the needs of their clients right now. So this isn't about necessarily talking about how difficult it is, right? Or, like, oh, our staff are heroes or stuff, even if they might be. But we want to talk about like those efforts and make it clear like there's a lot of work going into this. This is true especially for a lot of our education organizations that kind of moved all their stuff virtually. For anyone that's ever had to teach virtually instead of in person, it is not a one-to-one transition, right? There's a lot of work that goes into that curriculum development, program delivery. It's important we give at least a little bit of a sense of that, right? Once again, we don't want to go over the top with it, but we want to let folks know there's hard work happening to make sure we're still meeting the needs of our clients. We can't just share kind of stories from the past, right? So there's definitely a place for those, kind of Throwback Thursday style. There's definitely an opportunity to talk about what we've done and what we will do, but we also have to be talking about at this point what we're doing. And this is true of any crisis, even when kind of a local physical disaster happens like a tornado or hurricane, and maybe you're in the arts space, right? Maybe you're in the journalism space. You're kind of outside the direct impact organizations that are kind of responding to the crisis. We still have to put our work in context in those kind of physical disaster situations, and going to be still very true here for all of us right now. And then finally, the number one thing we hear when kind of talking about telling stories, kind of the communication we do to donors during a disaster or crisis, is we can't be silent. There is that kind of urge that says, like, there's so much happening, maybe I shouldn't add my voice to the noise. But we need to be there talking about kind of the role we're playing or will be playing in recovery. Because all of our organizations with the social issues we focus on have some type of kind of piece to the puzzle for our communities to rebuild or rebuild something new. And we need to make that kind of story clear to donors. So someone's talking about how to do some of these group donor meetings with kind of without kind of making it clear kind of who's donating, right? So they don't want to, especially if you're from a smaller area, smaller town, you don't want to necessarily kind of out or kind of explain like, okay, these 20 people give me money. That's a great point. So there, you could do a recorded video, right, and send it to a small group, BCC'd, and have them kind of respond over email. There are ways to do Zoom, and also some other kind of webinar platforms where you can't see necessarily the names that are showing up. You can actually set kind of a privacy setting for that. And you could also do something like a Facebook Live or a YouTube Live, which is going to be a little less obvious about kind of who's watching right then, right? So there are platforms you can still do that kind of specific kind of group meeting, but not necessarily make it public about who's attending. The fourth tip, showing gratitude. So we talked a little bit about this yesterday also during a couple of sessions, but time and time again, we see a key to kind of retaining those donors and also keeping people engaged both during and after the crisis, and thanking them consistently and constantly. So when we say constant, I don't mean necessarily every day, right? We're not kind of calling, bothering our donors every day to say thank you. But pretty much every message we send, especially those kind of monthly updates, a portion of it should be talking about our gratitude for supporters or volunteers or board or someone. Even if we're not thanking them personally, we're thanking another type of supporter, just the fact that there's always a theme of gratitude in our communications makes us feel more grateful to them, right? So we need to be thanking them and thanking, donors or that type of support, but just thanking someone makes us feel more grateful, makes them feel more connected to us. We need to do that personal thanking, thank you letters, those type of stuff for bigger donors, kind of calls and meetings, but also that group outreach as well. And the more we become kind of constant with it, the more authentic it feels, right? If I only thank you like the day before I ask you, the day after you give, and like on like December 30th, it's gonna be pretty obvious I'm doing those things because I'm a fundraiser and I have to. If I just thank you on a regular basis all the time, you actually begin to kind of feel like this is a real authentic appreciation for the gift and for the support. When we think about it, not just constantly, but also kind of deep, right? So we want to make sure that like we're not just kind of thanking once, but we're thanking in a few different ways. So we often all, right, at least theoretically, thank our donors right after they give a gift, right? They either get an automatic thank you letter, we mail a letter a couple weeks later, or a week later. And often those top kind of 10 or 20 donors actually get regular communications from us, and we outreach kind of to talk to them a few times a year. But beyond that, we don't necessarily have a lot of stewardship we're doing at a lot of organizations. So finding ways during a crisis like this that we need to find ways to kind of personally reach out to our top 100 donors. Now, once again, that sounds like a lot. But if you do this just yourself as ED or development director, one donor call or kind of donor meeting a day, you're going to do this in kind of a handful of months, right? If you do like 2 or 3 a day, even faster. In most cases, we can find at least one board member to help with this or one other staff member. And as I think we showed, if you do 2 or 3 of these meetings or calls a day with 2 or 3 people, you can actually get to your top 100 in about 3 weeks, right? So it is easier than it sounds and important to kind of plan for. We want to send that thank you a couple times in the first 90 days. After someone gives, the first 90 days is when they decide kind of their relationship with the organization. So it's important we're reaching out quickly. And once again, authenticity. We want to make sure it comes from a person, not the organization, and that they feel that someone on our team is personally grateful that they gave. We want to find ways to be bold. What I mean by that is simply that we have a really focused theme or message, right? So if we're just saying generally support education, we do good stuff. Too much noise out there, that's not going to cut through, so we need to be really specific. So having a specific theme, specific reason we're asking, kind of reason for the campaign we're doing. We want to try to tap into some positive emotions or personal emotions. So a little bit like Jamie talked about with Giving Tuesday in Baltimore, either tapping into that kind of chip on the shoulder, right, or kind of personal value that someone holds, or those positive emotions like hope and change. Those are going to get more people to give more than negative emotions like fear or guilt. And then finally, we're thinking about making sure we actually are asking, right? One thing that happens during crisis fundraising is that a lot of times we set up the appeal, but we don't actually make the hard ask. It's really important to make sure we're still specifically asking for funding right now. A couple of final quick tips. We'll answer some questions. I know we're right at time. For fundraising during a crisis, consider recurring gifts. So a lot of our returning donors, especially those in the middle level that are donating kind of $250, $500, may not have the liquidity right now if there's been a job loss, right, or job uncertainty to give $500 all at one time. But maybe you can transition to some of those people to $25 a month, right, $50 a month. In a lot of cases, it's actually an upgrade on their annual giving. So it'll feel kind of less anxiety inducing for them than writing kind of a $500 check right now. For new donors that come to you because of COVID, especially for your frontline organization, we have to keep these people a little bit separate in our donor database, because when we go back to steward them or ask next year, we want to try to keep as many of these folks engaged as we can. But our appeal is going to have to be a little bit different because they came to us during a time of crisis, not kind of during our typical fundraising channels. We want to find ways to stay top of mind for foundations and major donors for both. The more we're in front of them, the more we're talking to them, the more likely we're going to retain them. We want to plan, once again, for some challenges across 2021 and probably even into 2022. Not being the bearer of bad news there. Most organizations did not close during the recession, despite that kind of prolonged decline, but they needed a plan for it. So making a plan is important there. We want to find new ways to kind of show the difference we're making. So making sure we're really telling that story of the difference we're making today, not just the difference we plan to make or the difference we made before. And then finally, when it comes to messaging, our mission is still our mission. People still love what we do because of why they already loved it. So not kind of totally abandoning that message during COVID, just adding some urgency and adding some context. All right, so with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up. The breakout rooms are going to start in just a few minutes. So we hope you'll join us for one of the breakout sessions. And then I will see all of y'all later for making the ask later this morning. Thank you.